सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया. That's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा. इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hi, good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Crosshairs, the print show where we discuss the big security or geopolitical news from India and the region. This week, I'm joined by Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, who, as many of you know, is one of India's leading experts on all things military in the region and commanded the Indian Army's Northern Command. I'm also joined here by the print columnist and China scholar Adil Brar, who many of you probably follow on the print. Thank you both for making the time to join us today. General Huda, I'll begin with you. Just as we were kind of thinking that this disengagement process on the LAC had come to, some fruition, if not complete fruition, the tensions were winding down. We have the big clash this last week at Chumigyatse in Arunachal Pradesh. What does this signify? Does this mean the LAC remains volatile and incidents like these will keep on happening, or is this just a one-off of the kind that took place for many years and continue to go on? What is your assessment, sir?
So Praveen, thank you for inviting me for the show. Look, as you know, Yangtze is an area that has been has a disputed status, and it's not the first time that the patrol is sort of coming into this area. The last incident we had was in September 2021. Where similarly, Chinese tried to enter and they were repulsed by us. I think what's serious this time and what's different this time is when you have hundreds of soldiers attempting to cross the LAC sort of surreptitiously at night, and literally, you have a major physical sort of scuffle that takes place. It's not, the PLA Western Theatre Command spokesperson said this was a routine patrol. So certainly, you can't classify it as a routine patrolling activity. I think the concern also, Praveen, is that, confidence building measures, protocols, all these have sort of weakened after what happened in May 2020. And with physical clashes like this happening, you could see the situation escalating, at least at the local level. So I'm sort of concerned that incidents like this, and particularly you are seeing Chinese coming in major, massive numbers, 200, 300, 400, that's the numbers that are given out. So I think the situation will remain volatile because there is distrust, there is mutual suspicion on both sides. So I see this continuing into the future.
So my next question to you, Adil, is have we been hearing anything at all from the Chinese on how they see this evolving situation on the LAC? A lot of optimism on this side periodically saying disengagement, some, reduction in tensions, maybe an end to whatever. Is that how the Chinese government and the PLA also see the situation, or are they determined to keep pushing until they reoccupy the territory they believe to be theirs?
Thank you for the question, Praveen, and thank you for having me. I think what PLA is trying to do at the moment is they're trying to achieve a certain parity or to be ahead of India in terms of, the infrastructure that is there at the LAC. So we've seen that they have an agenda in mind, which is, in terms of what is happening in the Western sector as well as Eastern sector. Though we don't hear this conversation officially discussed by the PLA, the statement that was made by the Western Theatre Command spokesperson only came up because there was a lot of discussion in Indian media, and the Chinese social media discussion had actually caught on and they had to respond to that. So it was only because of that we had this response, and otherwise there is a sense of silence. We don't hear any conversations about what has to be done. Primarily, the conversation is mostly about how India and US are aligning and where is India's economic growth going. And every day we hear about these things about, India becoming the chair of G20, what Mr. Modi said in Bali. So the border discussions are very thin in terms of the commentary in even the local papers or like People's Daily. But on the other hand, in this case, Tawang's case, what we know is that they want to reoccupy this Chumigatsar area, the waterfall that is there. They've had this intention for a long time. You can go online, you can find social media discussion about it, PLA veterans discussing about it. So there is that intention, and Indian Army needs to be prepared both in the eastern sector as well as in the western sector as we speak. And so we would not be able to clearly find any evidence for, in social media discussions or even official media, how they want to end this, but we just have to keep our guards up.
Thank you, Adil. General Huda, I mean, to a non-military person, some of this skirmishing on the line of control has always been little strange in the sense that it involves 1 or 2 kilometers of territory of ultimately no great military or economic value to either country. Nothing that would give a decisive advantage to one or the other apparently. Yet the Chinese, you were there when when this sort of great process of pushing started at the LAC in the wake of the global economic crisis. Yet the Chinese seem to think that some of this assertion is tremendously important to them. They've built roads, invested a lot of money in hardening their defenses. What do you think as a military person drives their thinking on pushing this confrontation?
So, Praveen, in my own sense, there are 2 factors. One, of course, is the whole issue of territorial sovereignty. I mean, you might say these areas are not sort of strategically important, but when you're talking about sovereignty over territories, I think it's an important aspect that we need to look at. Right. I say this even for Siachen, people say, look, why are we sitting there? And what's the point of being in such harsh terrain, harsh area? So I think it's an issue. Look, this belongs to us. And so that sentiment is always there. The second thing, and I mean, we could just look at this is, I think they use the fact that the LAC is not demarcated, there are disputed areas, as a sort of pressure point on India. Look, from a larger sort of geopolitical angle, you are doing this, you're getting close to the US, you are doing exercises with the US military close to the LAC. This is an area where we can sort of put some pressure on you, not only militarily, but as you've seen, even in small incursions like this have a huge political fallout.
Right.
So therefore, I think they use this disputed border as an area where, look, we are able to put sort of pressure on India and show look, who's the boss here. So I think that the territorial sovereignty aspect and also the use of the LAC to put pressure on India.
So, Adil, I just want to pick up on what General Huda just said. And, in India for many years, there has been debate around Tawang, something that you also mentioned. China, of course, for our viewers, claims sovereignty over all of Arunachal Pradesh. It has never held it. India claims sovereignty up to Aksai Chin, which again has never been actually physically held by India. And there has been since the 1950s some conversation around doing a swap, settling the border. We know Prime Minister Modi early in his tenure was very optimistic about bringing about some kind of agreement. And after every one of these clashes, we hear the Chinese say, well, we want peaceful negotiation and settlement on the border. Do you agree with General Huda that an unsettled border actually suits them and they want to leverage this? Or do we see any discussion at all in China saying that, look, these are nuclear states, powerful entities in Asia, we don't need a crisis or a war, let's settle this? I mean, what is the internal debate in China on this issue?
That was an excellent point by General Huda about maintaining this sort of issue as a simmering issue. I think in terms of discussion in China, there was a recent article by one of the leading experts in China. He's one of the leading experts on South Asia in China. They spoke about how India offers an alternative development model to the Asian region, to the world. So China has to promote its own development story in Asia to remain above India in the hierarchy within the Asian pecking order. And that is exactly why this border issue remains an issue that China wants to keep simmering. They will never articulate in the way we are articulating it. But if you read between the lines, if you read between the lines of how China promotes BRI, its own development ideology across Asia and across the world, and they see that India is one of the biggest countries which can actually challenge the Chinese model, so to speak, in the region. The border disputes that they have settled in the past, let's say Mongolia, Kazakhstan, they happened right after Tiananmen Square. There was a certain political environment that led to those settlements. We don't have that right now, but those countries don't have a sort of civilizational background which India has, that China is concerned about. So keeping this border issue simmering is in Beijing's interest, and I think they definitely want to keep it the way it is.
General Huda, in terms of India responding to this sort of volatility on the line of actual control, one of the things I think that concerns a lot of people in the strategic community, you've also mentioned this earlier, is that these skirmishes end up sucking enormous resources out of the Indian military. It's a giant border running thousands of kilometers, posting troops at every potential friction point, building roads to supply them, all costs a lot of money, and that's money that doesn't go into then military modernization and then developing the kinds of resources that we need. Is there a smarter way for India to be approaching the defense of its borders, or is this something that we will just simply have to find the rupees and paise to continue with, as we have found the rupees and paise to deal with Siachen and our troubled border with Kashmir? Or does new technology, new techniques offer some way forward on some of these things?
So, Praveen, what you're mentioning is a huge dilemma, at least for the Indian Army, particularly. And after what has happened in 2020, you have seen that much more sort of additional forces, have got pumped into both Ladakh and into the eastern sector. There has been some realignment of forces from the west to the northern border. Unfortunately, in the short term, I don't see an answer to this. Until our infrastructure improves, until our roads go right up to our borders, until, for example, you get a whole year connectivity into Ladakh. If Ladakh is going to remain cut off for say 6 months in a year, and the only way to get reinforcements is by air, then obviously you will have to have sort of reserves, forces in place. And there is a similar situation in Arunachal Pradesh, where roads are not right up to the LAC. But I think in the long run, we have to adopt, as you said, a much smarter solution. This is not sustainable in the long run because it's going to take up so much of your revenue budget that modernization is going to get impacted. So more extensive surveillance means along the LAC, using electronic surveillance, drones, aircraft, heli-lift capability to be able to move troops quickly into areas which are sort of flash points and which happen. So I think technology does offer an answer in the long run, but as I said, in the short term, I don't see any other option. I don't think India can militarily or politically afford another May 2020 type of incident along any of its borders. And last point, I think we also need to look at how this whole border management is being done. I mean, do we need two forces? ITBP is also parallelly deployed, Army is also deployed. Can there be some integration of resources here? Because that, I think, is also an area where you could have some cost savings.
I just if I may draw you out, sir, we've had this discussion since the Kargil war about rationalizing deployments on our borders. You had a group of ministers who went into it at great length, and there was all this conception of one force, one border, etc., etc. To draw you out as a military person, is it just because of empire building, bureaucratic, military that these reforms have not fully happened? Or is it more complex than that?
So let me give you a blunt answer. Praveen, this is empire building and bureaucratic sort of issues. How can you have two different ministries looking after a disputed border? So you have the ITBP under the MHA and the army under the Ministry of Defense. Technically, the ITBP is in charge of the border, but major reactions to any incidents are always done by the army because obviously they have much more capability. You have the ITBP raising its own forces, the army sort of doing its own thing. I mean, why is it that we cannot sort of combine these, have an integrated planning, have an integrated sort of operational plan for border management? I think the worry that the ITBP will get absorbed under the army is not really true, because if you look at the JNK model along the LAC, the BSF deployed there is under operational control of the army, and it has not lost its basic organizational character. So it's not as if models don't exist. The BSF army model at the LOC, the same model can be applied at the LAC.
Sir, if I may add, I was just having a fascinating conversation the other day where I learned that actually the ITBP in Ladakh today buys its rations and supplies from the Indian Army. They actually paid for in cash from the Indian Army's forward depots, which just tells you what a strange situation that is, that you have, Force A bringing in forces and Force B of the same country buying its rations from them. But Adil, a question for you here. Across Arunachal Pradesh particularly, but also elsewhere on the border, we're seeing China pump a lot of money into developing border villages, and every 6 months you have some sort of official story about some brave Tibetan herders who have put down roots and stood like a wall against India. You've seen this stuff. Does this speak to an anxiety within China about the long-term stability of Tibet? Or is China confident at least that that is not an issue? And I ask this, of course, because the original genesis of China's policies in the region were concerns about what might happen in Tibet over the long term and whether India might not be able to capitalize on that today. Is that still something that plays in minds in the People's Republic?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at how Tibet, the population in Tibetan regions is organized, it's only primarily in the major cities, Lhasa, Shannan, there's Chengdu region. So, and they don't have any major populations along the border. So if you look at the Indian side, you have major cities and big population presence all across Himalayas. They don't have that. So the solution they've come up with is to settle these people. They call it poverty alleviation. They bring in herders, they settle them there. They're pumping a lot of money because these activities are not generating any revenue, so to speak. They are spending money as a policy instrument to create a national security barrier to these policy instruments, to create something which can counter a future ingress or some sort of operation by India, by creating signatures on the ground. They go to places in Arunachal, they write in Chinese on stones and leave these stones over there, so that they're leaving these markers so that they can create or justify future occupation. So it comes down to how do you counter these sort of gray zone activities, which are not easily something we can monitor through military means. This is something that will require a more creative approach, monitoring, as General Huda mentioned, technology to keep an eye on. But definitely, I believe that there is a big concern about Tibet and where Tibet might go in the future after His Holiness Dalai Lama passes away, and how much of this population dynamic of Tibet remains an issue if any bureaucrats from central China go to Tibet. They complain about suffering in this very hostile environment. So they're also trying to solve a whole host of issues, which sometimes are a response to India, but also sometimes are a response to their own local Tibetan issues, how China wants to see Tibet.
If I may draw you out a little bit there, Adil, I mean, with this Tibetan issue, one of the things that sort of underpinned India's response was that levels of development on both sides of the border were roughly equivalent. But with China pumping in all this money, there's roads, railway lines, these model villages with tennis courts we see from satellite pictures. Do you worry at all that coming generations of young people in places like Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh might wonder, as they are today in countries like Bhutan, whether maybe their ancestors made the right decision by supporting India, or whether they wouldn't have been more prosperous across the border? And if this is something Indian policymakers should be worrying about, what ought they be doing about it?
Yeah, I think in terms of long-term thinking, we have to be concerned about this type of psychological operations by China. They use radio transmission to send stories across to Arunachal, and you can get China mobile signal in Ladakh. So we have to be concerned about these things, especially now. China has 5G in regions of Ladakh. We don't even have 4G in parts of Ladakh. So young people will ask these questions.
I must interrupt and say we don't even have 4G working properly in parts of Delhi. But please go on, just in a lighter vein.
Exactly. So, and you hear some of the local councillors in Ladakh talk about these issues. They don't have roads, they don't have water supply, and they look at these videos coming out of eastern Ladakh on the Chinese side, of course, Tibetan side. They see these well-built villages, beautiful villages that Beijing is pumping money to build, and they see how good the roads are. So they will eventually ask these questions: where are we as compared to this story of Indian development story, and where is China going? So, and that's exactly where the government needs to invest resources, not just militarily defending the border, but also creating an environment where people have an affinity to Delhi, that they are offering a sort of package to them. They are here because there's somebody looking after them, like Beijing is looking after their own people.
General Huda, last question, or I should say last question before one quick one to both of you. 1959, when India decided to respond to Chinese incursions, of course, different country, different army, different circumstances. But very largely, we stepped into a war that we were not prepared for and expecting. In fact, the government and army headquarters, or at least the consensus, was that war wouldn't really happen. Are we being still too casual about this? Is there a risk of lurching into a full-scale war with China, even if it is by accidents or by miscalculations? But does that war risk still exist in your view?
So, Praveen, risks are always there. But if you ask me to see, where the greater probability lies, I think the greater probability lies in some localized conflict breaking out, because we are clearly seeing, restraint on China on the use of military force along the LAC. That restraint seems to have loosened. If you're going to use 400, 500, 600 troops coming into some areas, you will see somebody firing at somebody else. And so, to me, the concern is a local incident leading to a military confrontation at the local level. A full-scale war starting from the western sector to the eastern sector is not very probable. But as I said, there's nothing that you can rule out. But the greater risk is of local conflicts breaking out. You've seen what happened in Tawang. There are other areas in Arunachal Pradesh, Asafila, Longju, what we call the fishtails area. These are all disputed areas. And if you see similar activity taking place in these areas, as I said, for it to escalate is not out of the realms of possibility.
So my final question to you, sir, which I'll also take to Adil after this. Do you still see any prospect for diplomacy and forward movement on settling the border? Or is that chapter, in your view, more or less closed now, given the way China is reacting? would there be any purpose served by the Prime Minister and the President of China sitting across the table and trying to hammer this out? Or has that door closed?
I don't think the border settlement is going to happen, and I don't think we should look at it at all for now. What we can see and what we can do, again, the other thing is, can we at least define the LAC? And to me, that also doesn't seem possible, that if you can, look at a completely defining the LAC in Western and Eastern sector. What I think we can do is, we have some agreed disputed areas, as we call them. Can we put in place some arrangement of how the two countries or the two armies should tackle these agreed disputed areas? What should be the norms of patrolling, etc., etc.? If we can do at least some of that, then maybe some tension that always happens when patrols sort of meet each other, try and assert their claims in disputed areas, that some tension could ease. So I would say the first step is sit down, talk about the agreed disputed areas, put in place some norms of how the two militaries should behave in those areas.
So again, to explain to our viewers, General Huda is referring to discussions which took place in 1995. And there the two countries hammered out a list of where they thought they both understood the LAC was, where they felt there were differences of perception. 12 areas, I think, of perceived difference were agreed on. But we see the goalposts there also sometimes shift. So Galwan and Depsang, where we now have a big problem, were not in that list. Today they are back at the center of things. Adil, are you also, like General Huda, a little bit pessimistic, or do you see some route for diplomacy to get us out of this very dangerous impasse we're in?
I'm somewhat pessimistic, but I think we might need a new agreement on, not bringing sticks and batons to the border. That's why we need to start with this, because we've seen this whole business of China, the PLA bringing different kind of weapons which are not in the agreements. And so they say we are not violating any agreements, but they might as well say that they are, because they are using violence. So we need to look at agreements, to renegotiate them, that we are not going to do that and you are also not going to. And maybe these are very basic sort of points. And from there, maybe the confidence starts building. We don't have that environment right now. I think there's a lot of mistrust between both sides. So I don't think we have it right now, but there is a possibility to start that negotiation. We cannot even get a date to discuss things. The 17th round is just hanging around. We don't have a date for that. But we'll have to keep an eye for an opportunity where some political changes happen within China, or the geopolitical environment around the region changes, which might give us an opportunity to renegotiate these agreements and set the rules of engagement. And from there, maybe something else comes out of it.
Thank you so much, Adil Brar, China expert and the print columnist, Lieutenant General Huda, for making the time. I think we're leaving this discussion with a slightly concerned and maybe a little bit pessimistic assessment of what lies ahead on the line of actual control. This seems like something that is going to be a feature of the India-China relationship for some time to come. But I think heading up into the new year, we can at least hope that we're not having too many of these discussions. Thank you so much again for making the time.
Thank you, Praveen.